Dawn broke wet and heavy over Port Moresby on the first day of March, 1943. Major Ed Larner watched rainwater pool on the Coral airstrip as his B-25 Mitchell crews ran their pre-flight checks, preparing for what the brass had already written off as a fool's errand. 31 years old, 72 combat sorties logged, not a single enemy vessel sent to the bottom. Intelligence had picked up something big. The Japanese were moving a massive force out of Rabaul. 8 cargo transports escorted by 8 destroyers, hauling nearly 7,000 soldiers south to bolster their defensive positions at Leh. The intercepts had been clear. This wasn't a supply run. This was a full-scale reinforcement convoy. Every transport that made it to shore meant another fortified division the Allies would have to root out, hill by bloody hill, through New Guinea's suffocating jungle. The mathematics were grim and simple. But Larner faced a problem that had haunted American bomber crews since the Pacific War began. How do you actually hit a moving ship? Traditional bombing doctrine called for attacks from 10,000 feet, altitude that gave Japanese captains all the time in the world to react. They'd watch American formations climb, plot the bomb trajectories in their heads, and simply steer their vessels away from the impact zones. For 8 months, 5th Air Force B-17s had been trying to nail Japanese convoys. Their success rate, 3%. Most ordnance ended up creating useless geysers in empty water while the targets steamed away untouched. The numbers told a brutal story. Drop a 1,000-pound bomb from altitude, and it takes 37 seconds to reach the ocean. In those 37 seconds, a destroyer moving at 30 knots covers 380 yards, more distance than 3 football fields laid end to end. The bombardier aimed at the ship's current position. The bomb arrived where the ship used to be. Larner had witnessed this failure over and over. Crews would return with pristine photographs showing textbook bombing patterns, tight clusters of explosions forming perfect circles around their targets. Around them, never through them. Pilots swore they'd scored direct hits. The reconnaissance photos proved otherwise. The Japanese kept sailing. American casualties kept mounting. In the past month alone, Larner's squadron had lost 4 aircraft attempting convoy strikes. 40 men gone. High-altitude bombing made his planes sitting ducks. Japanese gunners tracked the slow-moving formations with methodical precision, calculated their lead times, and filled the sky with flak. By the time the bombs actually fell, half the squadron would be trailing smoke. General George Kenney, commanding 5th Air Force, had floated an idea that sounded certifiably insane to every experienced pilot who heard it. Skip your bombs across the water like flat stones on a pond. The concept was deceptively simple. Scream in at 50 feet. Release at 300 yards with a 5-second delay fuse. Let physics do the rest. The bomb would bounce once, maybe twice, then slam into the hull or detonate just below the waterline. The theory was sound, the academics insisted. The pilots called it a death sentence. Taking a twin-engine bomber down to 50 feet above ocean swells, then flying it straight toward a ship packed with anti-aircraft guns. It violated every survival instinct Larner had honed over 72 missions. Japanese destroyers bristled with weaponry, 127mm main batteries, 25mm autocannons, and dozens of lighter machine guns. Every single weapon could track a low-altitude bomber. One solid hit to an engine, and the B-25 would cartwheel into the Pacific before anyone could react. Higher command had actually prohibited the tactic, twice. Too experimental, too dangerous, unproven in combat. Larner had submitted requests to practice skip bombing in December, then again in January, both denied. The official response labeled it reckless disregard for equipment and personnel. Air crews needed to focus on proven high-altitude methods, except high-altitude methods weren't sinking anything. Want to see how Larner's desperate experiment played out? Hit that like button. It helps us bring more forgotten Pacific War stories to light. And subscribe if you haven't already. Now, back to Larner. Larner made his way to the operations tent and laid out fresh reconnaissance photographs across the planning table. The Japanese convoy had been spotted at first light, steaming southeast through the Bismarck Sea. 8 heavy transports arranged in 2 columns with destroyers forming a protective screen around the flanks. Every vessel crammed with troops, artillery pieces, ammunition crates. If those transports completed their voyage to Leh, the New Guinea campaign would drag on for another year of brutal fighting. Larner had an idea, one that would either validate Kenney's faith in low-altitude tactics or get 60 American airmen killed before noon. The convoy would enter striking range at 9 in the morning, 3 hours to prepare, 3 hours to teach his pilots how to fly in ways they'd never attempted. He summoned his squadron leaders and spread the forbidden plan across the table, the one they'd been banned from practicing. The B-25 Mitchell hadn't been designed for what Larner was proposing. Built for medium-altitude level bombing, the aircraft's twin Wright Cyclone engines could push it to 300 miles per hour in straight flight. But raw speed meant nothing if Japanese gunners had 30 seconds to zero in on your approach vector. Kenney's modification changed the entire equation. 5th Air Force mechanics had gutted the bombardier's nose station and installed 850 caliber machine guns pointing forward. 4 mounted in the nose itself, 4 more in blister housings along the fuselage sides. The B-25 had transformed into a flying gun battery, capable of spitting 200 rounds per second at a target. The tactical theory was elegant. Saturate the ship's anti-aircraft positions with suppressive fire during your attack run. Force the gunners to choose between shooting back and taking cover. Make them decide whether they wanted to defend their ship or stay alive. Larner had watched the mechanics bolt those guns onto his aircraft 3 weeks back. The modification added 1,200 pounds of weight. It shifted the center of gravity forward. It turned his medium bomber into something that didn't fit any existing classification. Part attack aircraft, part maritime strike fighter. Something entirely new. The practice sessions had been conducted in secrecy. Kenney had located a wreck called the Pruth, a 4,700-ton steamer that ran aground on Natiara Reef near Port Moresby back in 1924. The rusting hulk sat half-submerged in shallow water, a perfect stationary target. Larner's crews flew practice runs at dawn and dusk when visibility was poor and witnesses were scarce. They learned to skim the wave tops at 270 miles per hour. They learned to time their bomb releases with precision. They learned what happened when you miscalculated. Lieutenant Jake Fawcett had miscalculated on February 16th. He'd come in too high, 70 feet instead of 50. His bomb skipped twice, cleared the Pruth entirely, and detonated 300 yards beyond the wreck in empty water. Fawcett's bombardier, Sergeant Mike Russo, recalculated the variables. Lower altitude, higher speed, closer release point. The next run, Fawcett came in at 45 feet. The bomb skipped once and punched into the Pruth's hull just below the waterline. Exactly where a warship's magazine would be located. Exactly where one bomb could detonate 1,000 tons of stored ammunition and tear a destroyer in half. But the Pruth wasn't firing back. That was the difference between practice and reality. A difference Larner's crews were about to learn the hard way. Larner spread the reconnaissance images across the briefing table and tapped the lead transport, 800 feet of steel, displacing 10,000 tons, capable of carrying 1,500 troops. The convoy's flagship. Every officer crowded into that tent understood what failure meant. Japanese reinforcements had turned Buna into a 6-month nightmare that cost 5,000 Allied casualties. Leh would be exponentially worse if those transports unloaded their cargo. Skip bombing demanded precision that most bomber crews had never attempted. The variables were unforgiving. Approach altitude, 50 feet above the water. Approach speed, 270 miles per hour. Release point, 300 yards from target. Bomb trajectory angle, 8 degrees. Delay fuse, 5 seconds. Miss any single variable, and your bomb would either skip over the ship harmlessly, detonate short of the target, or hit the water at the wrong angle, and sink without exploding. Larner assigned each pilot a specific target. Transports 1 through 8, destroyers as backup targets if the transports were already burning. No bomber would attack the same ship twice. Maximum efficiency, maximum destruction, 1 pass, 1 bomb, 1 chance. The crews filed out to their aircraft at 7 in the morning, 54 men climbing into 9 B-25s. Behind them, 13 Beaufighters from the Royal Australian Air Force would strafe the convoy first, suppressing anti-aircraft fire. Above them, 16 B-17 Flying Fortresses would bomb from altitude, forcing the Japanese ships to break formation and maneuver. P-38 Lightning fighters would tie up Japanese Zeros at high altitude, but the killing blow would come from Larner's 9 bombers at 50 feet.
Larner climbed into his aircraft at 7:15. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Tom Benz, was already working through the pre-flight checklist. The bombardier, Staff Sergeant Carl Walls, was checking and rechecking the bomb release mechanism, his 4th inspection. Nobody spoke. The entire crew had flown together for 9 months. They understood what a 50-foot approach meant. They understood the odds. Larner fired up the port engine, then the starboard. The right cyclones caught and settled into their familiar thunder. Around him, 8 other B-25s were spinning up their engines. The formation would launch in flights of 3. Larner's flight first. Stay low over the water the entire distance. Japanese radar couldn't pick up aircraft below 100 feet. Surprise was their only real advantage. At 7:45, Larner released the brakes and began his takeoff roll. By 9:30, he'd know whether Kenney's theory worked, or whether he just led his entire squadron to their deaths. The flight to the Bismarck Sea took 90 minutes. Larner held his formation at 30 feet above the ocean, low enough that spray from the wave crests occasionally spattered his windscreen. The B-25s flew in a loose V formation, each aircraft separated by 200 yards, close enough to maintain visual contact, far enough that one flak burst couldn't take down 2 bombers. Radio silence. The Japanese monitored every frequency. One transmission and the convoy would know American bombers were inbound. Surprise was worth more than coordination. Larner checked his watch. 8:30. The convoy should be 60 miles northeast, steaming at 12 knots toward the Vitiaz Strait, right on schedule according to the morning reconnaissance report. The ocean below stretched empty in every direction. No whitecaps, no Japanese patrol boats, just endless blue water to the horizon. Flying this low, Larner couldn't see more than 5 miles ahead. The convoy could be anywhere. His navigation had to be flawless. 5 degrees off course and they'd miss the target entirely. Come up on the convoy from the wrong angle, and the destroyers would have time to bring their main batteries to bear. At 8:52, Larner spotted smoke on the horizon. Black diesel exhaust from 16 ships steaming in formation. He keyed his throat microphone once. A single click, the signal to tighten formation. His wingmen acknowledged with single clicks of their own. Radio discipline holding. The convoy materialized as they closed the distance. 2 columns of transports, 4 ships per column. Destroyers formed a protective screen 2 miles ahead and on both flanks. Larner counted gun positions on the nearest destroyer. 6 main turrets, dozens of smaller weapon mounts. Every gun would be tracking his approach once they broke the horizon. At 8:57, the Beaufighters went in. Larner watched from 3 miles out as 13 Australian aircraft dove on the convoy from the northeast. Their 20-millimeter cannons raked the destroyer decks. Tracers arced across the water in brilliant streams. The Japanese anti-aircraft guns swung toward the new threat, exactly as planned. The Beaufighters weren't there to sink ships. They were there to make the gunners look the wrong direction. 30 seconds later, the B-17s arrived overhead at 10,000 feet. Larner saw their bomb bay doors open. Ordnance tumbled toward the convoy below. The Japanese ships began evasive maneuvers, turning hard to port and starboard. The columns broke apart. Spacing increased. The destroyers accelerated to flank speed, white water foaming at their sterns. Confusion. Perfect. Larner pulled back on the throttles and descended to 40 feet. His airspeed dropped to 260 miles per hour. Waltz, his bombardier, was calling out distances. 4,000 yards, 3,800, 3,600. Each ship in the convoy was now clearly visible. Larner selected his target, the second transport in the port column. 700 feet long, sitting low in the water, fully loaded. His bomb would hit amidships, right where the troop compartments were packed with soldiers. The destroyer on the left flank spotted them. Larner saw muzzle flashes. The first shells arced toward his formation, too high. The Japanese gunners were accustomed to tracking bombers at altitude. They hadn't adjusted for a 50-foot approach yet. At 2,000 yards, Larner opened fire. All 8 50-caliber machine guns hammered in unison. Tracers walked across the transport's superstructure. Glass shattered, metal sparked and rang. Men on deck dropped or dove for cover. The suppression was working. The anti-aircraft crews couldn't shoot back while half-inch bullets were tearing through their positions at 800 rounds per minute, 1,200 yards. Larner's wingmen were spreading out, each bomber lining up on its assigned target. The formation was fragmenting by design, 9 bombers attacking 9 ships simultaneously. No time for the defenders to shift fire. No time to coordinate a response. 800 yards. The destroyer's main guns fired again. This time the shells bracketed Larner's flight. Left, right, close enough to rock the aircraft with concussion. Shrapnel pinged off the fuselage. Benz, the co-pilot, called out, "Damage!" Port engine oil pressure dropping. Still in the green. 600 yards. The transport filled Larner's windscreen. He could see individual soldiers on deck scrambling for cover. Could see the bridge windows, could see the ship's gun crews swinging their weapons toward him. Every instinct screamed to pull up, to climb, to get away from the wall of steel rushing toward him at a combined closing speed of 300 miles per hour, 400 yards. Walz's voice cut through the engine roar. "Bomb armed, ready for release, 300 yards. Larner pressed the bomb release. He felt the aircraft lurch upward as 1,000 pounds dropped free. The bomb tumbled forward, carried by momentum. It hit the water nose first, skipped once like a flat stone, and arrowed toward the transport's hull. Larner pulled hard on the control yoke and climbed. Behind him, the 5-second fuse was counting down. The bomb detonated at the waterline. Larner didn't see the explosion. He was climbing hard, his vision filled with sky, but he felt it. The shockwave hit his aircraft like a physical blow, lifting the tail and throwing the B-25 sideways. Benz fought the controls. The altimeter spun through 100 feet, 200, 300. Larner risked a glance back. The transport was splitting open. A column of fire and black smoke erupted from amidships. The hull buckled. Metal shrieked. Secondary explosions rippled through the superstructure as ammunition stores cooked off. The ship listed to port, already taking water through the massive hole torn in its side. Soldiers were jumping overboard, dozens of them, tiny figures abandoning a dying ship. One bomb. 15 seconds from release to catastrophic damage. Skip bombing worked. To Larner's right, Lieutenant Jake Fawcett's bomber was pulling up from its own attack run. Another transport was burning, flames climbing its forward mast. To the left, Captain Bill Benn had just released on a destroyer. The bomb skipped twice and hit below the aft turret. The destroyer's stern lifted out of the water from the internal explosion. When it crashed back down, the entire rear third of the ship was gone. The destroyer began settling by the stern, sinking fast. 4 targets hit in the first 90 seconds. The Japanese convoy was in chaos, but the defenders were adapting fast. A destroyer on the far flank had turned to face the bombers head-on. Its main guns fired in rapid succession. The shells walked across the water toward Lieutenant Tom Mitchell's B-25. The first shell missed by 50 yards, the second by 20. The third hit. Mitchell's aircraft disintegrated. The bomb under the fuselage detonated on impact. The explosion vaporized the bomber instantly. No parachutes, no survivors. 5 men gone between one heartbeat and the next. Larner watched the debris scatter across the water. No time to process it. No time to mourn. The attack was still happening. The remaining B-25s pressed their attacks. Lieutenant Carl Johnson lined up on the lead transport, the convoy flagship. His approach was textbook. 50 feet, 270 miles per hour, machine guns blazing. The Japanese crew was firing back with everything they had, 20-millimeter cannons, heavy machine guns, even rifles. The air between Johnson's bomber and the transport was solid with tracers. Johnson's bomb release was perfect. The weapon skipped once and punched through the transport's hull just forward of the bridge. The delay fuse gave it time to penetrate deep into the ship before detonating. The explosion tore through 3 decks. Fire erupted from the cargo holds. Larner knew what was in those holds: ammunition, artillery shells, fuel drums. The transport became an inferno. Men were burning on deck, jumping into the sea, trailing smoke.
Lieutenant Paul Warren's bomber took hits during its approach. A Japanese gunner on one of the destroyers had finally adjusted for the low-altitude attack. 20-millimeter shells ripped through Warren's port wing. Fuel streamed from the punctured tank. Warren held his course. 300 yards, 200. At 150 yards, he released. The bomb skipped and struck the transport below the waterline. Warren banked hard right, trailing fire. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Dave Miller, was already activating the fire suppression system.
The flames died. The bomber was still flying. Barely. 6 transports burning or sinking. 2 destroyers damaged. 1 B-25 lost. The attack had lasted 4 minutes. The second wave was coming in. 9 more B-25s from the 91st Bomb Squadron, led by Major Ralph Chelly. They'd watched Larner's attack from 5 miles out. They knew the tactic worked. They knew the cost. Chelly's formation spread out, each bomber selecting a target from the ships still afloat. The Japanese were ready this time. Every gun in the convoy was tracking low. The destroyers had formed a defensive line, their main batteries firing in coordinated volleys. The ocean erupted with shell splashes. The barrage was intense, deadly, calculated. The Japanese had learned from the first attack. They would make the Americans pay for the second. Chelly's bomber came in from the east, directly into the sun. Smart. The Japanese gunners were half blind, firing at shadows. His bomb hit a transport that was already listing. The explosion accelerated the sinking. The ship rolled onto its side and went under in less than 2 minutes. 1,200 soldiers went down with it. Lieutenant Harold Jensen wasn't as lucky. His approach angle was wrong, too shallow, too fast. His bomb skipped 3 times, cleared the target destroyer entirely, and detonated harmlessly beyond the convoy. Jensen pulled up and circled for another run. The Japanese destroyer he'd missed tracked him the entire turn. When Jensen came around for his second pass, the destroyer was waiting. The first shell took off his port engine. The second hit the cockpit. Jensen's B-25 rolled inverted and crashed into the sea at 300 miles per hour. No explosion, just impact. The ocean swallowed the aircraft and kept moving. 2 bombers down, 7 transports sinking, 3 destroyers crippled. The battle had been raging for 8 minutes, and Larner realized with cold clarity that the Japanese still had 60 Zero fighters somewhere above the clouds. The Zeros appeared at 9:15, 18 of them diving from 12,000 feet. Larner saw them through scattered clouds, silver shapes dropping toward the bombers like hawks on field mice. The P-38 Lightnings were supposed to keep them occupied. Something had gone wrong. Either the Lightnings were outnumbered or the Japanese had committed a second fighter group nobody knew about. Larner's B-25 was vulnerable, low on fuel, low on ammunition. The machine guns in his nose had maybe 200 rounds left. Not enough for a sustained dogfight, not enough to hold off a determined Zero pilot who'd learned to respect American bombers the hard way. He pushed the throttles forward and dove to wave-top height. 20 feet, 15. The propellers were churning salt spray. The Zeros split into 2 groups. Half stayed high to engage the P-38s. The other 9 went after the bombers. They came in fast, 400 miles per hour, firing their 20-millimeter cannons from 1,000 yards out. Larner saw tracers arc past his canopy. Too close. He jinked left, then right, making himself a difficult target. Behind him, Staff Sergeant Tommy Blake was in the dorsal gun turret, firing short controlled bursts at the nearest Zero. The Japanese fighter broke off, not damaged, just cautious. Lieutenant Warren's damaged bomber wasn't so lucky. A Zero latched onto his tail and stayed there. Warren tried every evasive maneuver he knew, climbs, dives, hard banking turns that stressed his damaged wing. Nothing worked. The Zero pilot was good, patient. He waited until Warren ran out of airspeed in a climbing turn, then fired a 2-second burst. Warren's starboard engine exploded. The bomber nosed over and went into the ocean. Larner saw 3 parachutes, 3 out of 5. Better than nothing. The Zeros pressed their attack for 6 minutes. Then, abruptly, they broke off and climbed. Larner couldn't figure it out until he saw why. The B-17s were coming back for a second pass at 10,000 feet. The Zeros had to choose. Attack the bombers below or defend the convoy from above. They chose above. The heavy bombers were the bigger threat to what remained of the convoy. Larner used the reprieve to assess damage. His port engine was running rough, oil pressure fluctuating, fuel gauge showing 60%, enough to make it back to Port Moresby. Maybe. He looked back at the convoy. 8 transports had been hit. 7 were sinking or already gone. The 8th was burning but still afloat, trying to make way toward the New Britain coast. All 4 destroyers on the screening line were damaged. 2 were dead in the water. The other 2 were circling the burning transports, trying to pick up survivors. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea wasn't over. It was 9:21. The initial attack had lasted 11 minutes.
but the killing would continue for 3 more days. American bombers would return every 6 hours. PT boats would hunt survivors in lifeboats. The Japanese had committed 7,000 troops to this convoy. Fewer than 1,200 would make it to Leh. The rest would drown, burn, or die of exposure in the tropical sun. Larner set course for home. His formation was scattered across 30 miles of ocean. 4 bombers were confirmed lost. 20 men dead or missing. But the mission had worked. Skip bombing had proven itself in the most brutal way possible. The technique would be refined, standardized, taught to every bomber squadron in the Pacific Theater. Within 6 months, Japanese commanders would abandon any attempt to move large convoys within range of Allied air power. The supply line to their forward bases would strangle. The war would turn. But Larner didn't know that yet. He only knew his fuel gauge was dropping, his engine was failing, and Port Moresby was 90 minutes away. He ordered his crew to dump everything non-essential, ammunition they couldn't use, tools, spare parts, anything to reduce weight. The B-25 was struggling to maintain altitude with one engine running rough. At 10:10, Benz spotted land, the southern coast of New Guinea. They were on course, barely. The port engine was shaking now, oil streaming from a crack in the housing, temperature gauge climbing into the red. 5 more minutes, and it would seize completely. Larner feathered the port propeller and transferred all power to the starboard engine. The bomber slowed to 180 miles per hour, just above stall speed, just enough to stay airborne. The coast was getting closer. 40 miles, 30, 20. The engine held. Larner landed at Port Moresby at 11:17. The runway was lined with ground crews, mechanics, intelligence officers. Word had spread. The convoy had been hit hard. Nobody knew how hard. Larner cut the engines and sat in the cockpit for 30 seconds, hands still gripping the control yoke. Benz was silent beside him. Neither man moved. They'd been flying for 3 hours and 42 minutes. It felt like 3 days. The debrief lasted 2 hours. Larner and his surviving pilots sat in the operations tent while intelligence officers asked the same questions in different ways. How many ships hit? How many sinking? How many bombs released? How many aircraft lost? The officers were building a picture from fragments. 9 pilots had attacked. 5 had returned. Mitchell gone. Jensen gone. Warren in the water, his crew picked up by a Catalina flying boat. 2 men wounded. The reconnaissance photos arrived at 1 in the afternoon. An Australian Beaufighter had photographed the convoy from 15,000 feet at noon. The images told the story Larner's crews couldn't. 8 transports, 7 confirmed sunk or sinking. The 8th beached on the New Britain coast, burning, 4 destroyers, 2 sunk, 2 severely damaged and withdrawing toward Rabaul. Total time from first attack to last ship down, 3 hours.
General Kenney arrived at Port Moresby at 4 in the afternoon. He walked directly to the operations tent and spread the reconnaissance photos across the briefing table. He didn't congratulate anyone, didn't shake hands. He pointed at the burning transport beached on the coast and said, "Finish it." The Australian Beaufighters would make another run at dusk. Nothing could be allowed to reach Leh. Nothing. The second strike launched at 5:30. Larner didn't fly. His bomber needed a new engine. Instead, he stood on the runway and watched 9 fresh B-25s take off into the setting sun. They'd be over the target at dusk. The Japanese survivors would be trying to salvage what they could from the beached transport. They wouldn't expect another attack. They'd be wrong. The strike returned at 8 in the evening. The beached transport was gone, sunk at its mooring. The 2 damaged destroyers had been caught trying to withdraw. Both hit, both sinking. The Japanese had started this operation with 16 ships. By nightfall on March 2nd, 14 were on the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. The remaining 2 destroyers limped into Rabaul at midnight, barely afloat. The cost in lives was catastrophic. 7,000 Japanese soldiers had embarked at Rabaul. Reconnaissance flights over the next 2 days counted approximately 900 survivors reaching the New Britain coast by lifeboat or swimming. American PT boats intercepted most of the lifeboats. Some survivors were rescued. Others were killed in the water. The distinction between combat and massacre blurred in those 3 days. Command ordered no quarter. The Japanese had machine-gunned American aircrew in parachutes. The Americans returned the favor to soldiers in lifeboats. Larner learned about it 3 days later. He didn't ask for details. didn't want to know which PT boat crews had fired on lifeboats, which bomber crews had strafed survivors swimming for shore. The war had rules until it didn't. The rules had stopped applying somewhere between Mitchell's bomber disintegrating and the last Japanese transport going under. Nobody talked about it. Nobody wrote it in after-action reports. It happened anyway. The final tally came through on March 7th. Japanese losses: 8 transports sunk, 4 destroyers sunk. Approximately 3,000 troops drowned. Another 1,500 killed by air attack. 1,200 reached Leh overland through the jungle. They arrived without weapons, without supplies, without organization. They were combat ineffective. The reinforcement operation had failed completely. American losses: 4 B-25s, 1 B-17, 2 P-38s. 13 aircrew killed, 6 wounded. Against an entire Japanese convoy, the exchange rate was absurdly one-sided. Skip bombing had worked. But it had worked because Larner's crews had been willing to fly straight at destroyers at 50 feet while anti-aircraft fire turned the air into metal. Courage didn't cover it. Insanity was closer. Kenney called it the most decisive air-sea battle of the Pacific War. Admiral Yamamoto called it a disaster. The Japanese Navy immediately canceled all future large convoy operations within range of Allied land-based air power. The supply line to New Guinea was cut. The garrisons at Lai, Salamaua, and Madang would have to survive on what they had. They wouldn't survive long. But the Battle of the Bismarck Sea changed more than Japanese strategy. It changed how every air force in the world thought about attacking ships. The Americans refined skip bombing. The British adopted it. The Soviets copied it. By 1944, low-altitude bombing had become standard doctrine for maritime strike aircraft worldwide. Larner flew 16 more missions before rotating home in May. He never spoke publicly about the battle, never gave interviews, never wrote a memoir. He'd done what was necessary. That was enough. The question nobody could answer was simple. Would the same tactic work against a prepared enemy? The Japanese tested that question 3 months later. On June 3rd, 1943, American reconnaissance spotted another convoy forming at Rabaul. 6 transports, 8 destroyers. This time the Japanese sailed at night. This time they had 60 Zero fighters providing continuous air cover. This time every destroyer carried additional 20mm anti-aircraft guns specifically positioned to defend against low-altitude attacks. They'd learned from the Bismarck Sea. They'd adapted. The 5th Air Force attacked at dawn. 12 B-25s using skip bombing. The results were different. 2 transports hit, 1 destroyer damaged, 3 B-25s shot down. The exchange rate had shifted. Japanese anti-aircraft defense had improved dramatically. Gunners who'd survived the Bismarck Sea had trained their replacements. They knew to track low. They knew to fire early. They knew to concentrate on the bombers during the final approach when the aircraft were committed and couldn't maneuver. The Americans adapted in return. By July, 5th Air Force mechanics had installed additional armor around the cockpit and engines. They'd increased the forward-firing armament to 12 50-caliber machine guns. Some B-25s carried 14 guns. The theory remained the same. Suppress defensive fire with overwhelming firepower during the approach. Give the enemy gunners no choice except take cover or die. The modification worked. On November 2nd, 1943, 38 B-25s attacked Rabaul Harbor in the largest skip bombing raid of the war. The harbor contained 18 warships and 30 merchant vessels. 18 received direct hits. 1 heavy cruiser sunk. 1 destroyer sunk. 2 auxiliary vessels destroyed. 16 merchant ships damaged or sinking. The raid lasted 18 minutes. American losses: 2 B-25s. The exchange rate had swung back in America's favor, but Rabaul proved something else. Skip bombing worked best against ships in confined waters, ships that couldn't maneuver freely, ships anchored in harbor or trapped in narrow straits. Against a convoy in open ocean with room to maneuver and fighter cover overhead, the tactic was dangerous. Against ships at anchor, it was devastating. The British adopted skip bombing in late 1943. Royal Air Force Beaufighters equipped with the technique attacked German convoys off Norway. The results mirrored the Pacific experience: high casualties, high success rate. The Germans responded by adding more anti-aircraft guns to their merchant vessels and requiring convoys to sail only under heavy fighter escort. The cost of moving supplies by sea increased dramatically. The effectiveness decreased proportionally. The Soviets used skip bombing against German ships in the Black Sea and Baltic. Their technique was cruder, lower approach altitude, heavier bombs, less suppressive fire. The results were mixed. Some ships sunk, many bombers lost. The Soviets had courage. They lacked the training and equipment refinement the Americans had developed through trial and error in the Pacific. By 1944, skip bombing had evolved beyond its original form. American tactics now included coordinated attacks. High-altitude bombers would attack first, forcing ships to maneuver. Fighters would strafe to suppress anti-aircraft fire. Then the skip bombers would come in low, while the defenses were distracted and disorganized. The multi-layered approach reduced losses while maintaining effectiveness. The statistics told the story. Between March 1943 and August 1945, American aircraft using skip bombing sank or severely damaged 212 Japanese vessels. The cost, 47 bombers lost. A kill ratio of 4.5 ships per bomber. For comparison, high-altitude bombing achieved a kill ratio of 0.3 ships per bomber. Skip bombing was 15 times more effective, but the human cost was harder to quantify. Skip bombing required crews to fly directly at ships bristling with weapons, maintaining a steady course while tracers filled the air around them. The psychological stress was immense. Pilots who flew skip bombing missions had shorter combat tours, higher rates of combat fatigue, more frequent medical groundings for stress-related conditions. The tactic worked. It also broke the men who flew it. Larner never flew skip bombing again after May 1943. He trained new crews, watched them take off on missions using the tactic he'd helped prove, watched some of them not come back. By war's end, he'd trained 62 pilots in skip bombing. 18 were killed in action. 23 were wounded. The mathematics were brutal. A 29% fatality rate, a 66% casualty rate, including wounded. Better than high-altitude bombing. Worse than almost any other combat aviation role. The question military historians would debate for decades was whether skip bombing shortened the war. The answer was complicated. Skip bombing didn't win battles by itself, but it strangled Japanese supply lines, made reinforcement prohibitively expensive, forced the Japanese Navy to abandon large-scale convoy operations. Without supplies, garrisons withered. Without reinforcements, defensive positions became indefensible. The islands fell one by one. What remained certain was this. On March 2nd and 3rd, 1943, 9 B-25 bombers flying at 50 feet had destroyed an entire Japanese convoy in 15 minutes of sustained combat. The tactic had been banned twice, called suicide by everyone who heard it, proven effective by men willing to fly into walls of anti-aircraft fire because the alternative was letting 7,000 enemy soldiers reach their destination. The bombers that attacked the Bismarck Sea Convoy were scrapped after the war. None survived as museum pieces. Major Ed Larner returned to the United States in June 1943. He was 31 years old. He'd flown 88 combat missions. He'd survived longer than most bomber pilots in the Pacific. The Army Air Force wanted him to train new crews, teach them what he'd learned, pass on the techniques that had worked. He refused. Larner requested and received a transfer to transport aircraft. He spent the rest of the war flying C-47s, moving supplies and personnel across the Pacific. No combat, no skip bombing, no more missions where he watched crews he'd trained die in aircraft he'd taught them to fly. He never explained the decision, never had to. Command understood. Some men could keep flying combat after what they'd seen. Others couldn't. There was no shame in either choice. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel in December 1943. He declined the promotion twice before accepting. He didn't want recognition. He wanted to finish the war and go home. He got his wish in September 1945. Japan surrendered. Larner mustered out 3 months later with a Distinguished Flying Cross, 2 air medals, and a Purple Heart from shrapnel wounds he'd never mentioned in any after-action report. Larner died in 1997 in Sacramento, California. He was 85 years old. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his military service in one sentence. It didn't mention the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, didn't mention skip bombing, didn't mention that he'd helped develop a tactic that changed naval warfare. He'd asked his family not to discuss it. They honored his request. General George Kenney received credit for skip bombing in most historical accounts. That was fine with Larner. Kenney had conceived the theory. Larner had just proven it worked. The distinction mattered to historians. It didn't matter to the pilots who flew the missions. They knew who'd led the first attack. They knew who'd trained them. They knew whose techniques kept them alive when Japanese gunners were tracking their approach at 50 feet. The B-25 Mitchell bomber became legendary partly because of skip bombing. The aircraft served in every theater of World War II, but its reputation was built in the Pacific, flying missions that shouldn't have been survivable. By war's end, B-25s had sunk more enemy shipping than any other bomber type. The technique Larner and his crews had proven in March 1943 became standard doctrine for every B-25 unit in the Pacific. No museum displays a B-25 specifically flown in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. The aircraft were worn out by war's end. Most were scrapped for aluminum. A few survive in museums, restored to flying condition, or displayed as static exhibits. The National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio has a B-25 Mitchell. So does the Smithsonian. Neither flew at the Bismarck Sea, but they represent the crews who did. The battle itself is largely forgotten outside military history circles. It doesn't have the name recognition of Midway or Guadalcanal. No major films were made about it. No famous photographs captured the moment, just after-action reports, reconnaissance images, and the testimony of men who mostly chose not to talk about what they'd done. What remains is this. In March 1943, a group of American bomber crews proved that aircraft could sink ships by skipping bombs across water at 50-foot altitude. The tactic was called suicide before they proved it worked. It was called genius afterward. The truth was somewhere between. It was desperation meeting innovation. It was men willing to try something untested because the tested methods weren't working. It was courage measured in the decision to maintain heading while anti-aircraft fire turned the air lethal. The Pacific War changed after the Bismarck Sea. Japanese convoys stopped sailing within range of Allied air power. Supply lines collapsed. Garrisons starved. Islands fell. The war moved closer to Japan, one island at a time, and the Japanese Navy couldn't stop it because they couldn't supply their forward positions. Skip bombing hadn't won the war by itself, but it had closed the supply route the Japanese needed to keep fighting. If this story resonated with you the way it did with us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to share this story with more people who need to hear it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're pulling forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day, stories that deserve to be told. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia. Our community spans the entire globe. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure Ed Larner and his crews don't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.